Architecture defines a culture just as much as their language, clothing, and location. The structures that exist reflect a lot of who and where the people are that use them. And while it is true that as of late we've let architects and engineers get away with bland, computer-generated looking messes, this wasn't always the case. Looking at these buildings, you can probably tell a lot about what these buildings are and where they are. This is a temple, obviously from East Asia, and the Japanophiles can probably narrow it down further. This one is clearly a tropical island home, this one is a downtown street in a traditional European city, and this one is a home in the north, somewhere. It's easy to tell what and where these buildings are, either because they have a distinctive style or they are specifically made for a certain environment, or both. Take the northern home and the island home. What about the northern home tells you that it's not from Brazil or Egypt? Well, obviously the snow, but what else? Let's ask ourselves, what are the main concerns of living in the far north? The cold and the snow. A stone foundation, thick log walls, and a steep roof all can handle heavy winter snows and keep much of the heat inside. This is also why there are smaller and fewer windows, and why the basement is larger than the attic. The ground is an excellent insulator against the cold, and especially the wind. This home almost feels like it was born from the surrounding environment. Big boulders and towering trees have been braving the environment, and so is this house. It's made from them. Now let's look at the island home. Main concerns for a tropical dwelling? Heat, humidity, and sun. Without air conditioning, the wind is your best friend on hot tropical days. The house's thin walls all have big windows, and there's a high internal ceiling. All of these allow every bit of ocean breeze to flow through and cool off the interior. The roof overhangs the windows as well, preventing the sun from reaching the interior or even the walls for most of the day. Without the use of air conditioning, the sun beating down on an enclosed space can quickly make it hotter than the outside. The stilted foundation is also quite the innovation. Letting air pass underneath the house will keep the floor much cooler than even the surrounding ground. These two homes are like a polar bear and an alligator, specially built for the place they live in and the niche they fill. With its thick walls and few tiny openings, the cabin would be a sauna if it were in the tropics. It would cost a fortune and waste immense amount of energy to cool down. Just for comparison, the haphazard suburban sprawl of Phoenix, Arizona uses 25% of its electricity on air conditioning. The beach house would have the opposite problem. A weak roof and frame would never hold up to the brunt of snow that even a tame state like Montana can offer. The windows would need to be boarded up, and the giant indoor space would be a nightmare to heat, and the floor would actually freeze over. Each of these homes fills a niche, just like the animals we talked about. When designing architecture for your world, think about what that niche is. What does a potter in the desert need? How about a weaver in the rainforest? Look here, what is this place and what do they do here? A blacksmith, they make horseshoes, swords, metal things. And this? A restaurant, they serve food and drinks. People come here to eat. Now, how about this? Our building style today is to create towering, anonymous fish tanks. They don't aim to fill a niche and so have no character. These skyscrapers could be anywhere in the US and these homes could be in any suburb. What a wasted opportunity. When world building, consider what plants, what rocks, and what other building materials are available in the area you're world building. Then, what the climate and weather are like. And lastly, what the building is there for. These three things are the niche that each of your buildings will fill. Creativity lies in limitation. It's why the architects of pre-industrial Begon in Paris have such striking holy sites. There is a great book that Worldbuilding Notes uses when she designs architecture, and I'll leave it in the description. It's essentially a how-to guide for what features buildings and settlements traditionally have for the climate they'll be in. Things like which way the buildings should face to minimize or maximize sun exposure, what the windows should look like, what part of the landscape to build on. These rules can apply not just to a pre-industrial culture, but also to a modern one that needs to be eco-conscious, or a future one that's essentially a pre-industrial one. With no regard for its environment and extremely high maintenance, in an apocalypse, Phoenix would not be one to rise from the ashes. So then, how do we design buildings for hot, arid climates like the one Phoenix finds itself in? As far as macro planning, Phoenix is in the worst possible place. Low down, in a valley, with unpredictable rivers. The city gets none of the cool breezes of the higher altitudes, it's baked in the sun all day because of the lack of mountains to the south, has no large bodies of water to regulate temperature, and experiences flooding. Main concerns for the desert? Heat, sun, and dust. There is one word that would vastly improve Phoenix. Density. The maze-like streets could actually be great at stopping the corrosive desert winds if they weren't so wide. Desert dwellings have done this for ages. Density would also mean less blacktop to contribute to the urban greenhouse effect, which makes cities considerably hotter than their surroundings. Not what we want in the desert. More density means more shade as well, to keep the areas from even getting hot in the first place. Trees or even large overhangs, if that's your style, could shade the walls of a building and could lower the need for AC quite a bit. To keep the city easily navigable while still getting the benefits of irregular street layouts, a simple staggered block pattern could be used. Using the remaining guidelines from the book, I've made a simple mock-up of what a city block in Phoenix could look like. Buildings in the desert should try to minimize exposure to the sun on their east and west sides. Buildings should be long along this axis. This way, in the mornings and in the afternoons, when they're directly being baked in the heat, the internal temperature of the building won't rise that much. Courtyards can be used to create new walls that are almost never exposed to the sun. Adding windows to these can create a giant ventilation shaft, taking hot air away from the structure. The shade provided by sunken courtyards can be easily managed with very large overhangs, like what was mentioned previously. The windows on the outside of the building, especially on the south and north faces, are very high up and very wide. That way, the large overhangs create shade, preventing sun from directly entering the building for most of the day. While this is just a simple mock-up, it could define the look of Phoenix and turn it from a generic city into a recognizable one. The staggered block layout I mentioned before would be an easy option and also easy to adapt. Barcelona has a much different climate from Phoenix, but similar block designs to the ones I've showed here, and it's unmistakable from the sky and the ground. Venice is another great example of a distinct city. Built as protection from invasion, there are so many tiny things that the buildings do to fill the niche they find themselves in. In fact, Venice is so recognizable that another city with canals and an entire country are named after it. But perhaps the best example of what Phoenix could be is Cairo. Dense, irregular streets littered with trees and still easily navigable. Also, bonus fact, Egypt and New Orleans have long, thin farm plots that were done so as many people as possible could have access to the river for water and shipping. It's the small considerations like these that go miles in making your culture and your city distinct and truly part of where it is in the world. Think, what do these people need and how do they get it? It's different for every place that people find themselves in.